The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous hymn as Laura Bennett moved through Mercy General's emergency department like a ghost trying to remember what solid felt like. 20 years of Navy combat medicine lived in her hands, muscle memory that didn't ask permission, that moved on its own when monitors flatlined and breath stopped. Her scrubs hung 2 sizes too large, deliberate camouflage. Her name tag read only Eld Bennett RN, as if she could abbreviate herself into irrelevance. The ER smelled like antiseptic and resignation, a scent that never quite washed out of the tile grout. She charted vitals in the nurse's station with obsessive precision, her handwriting a study in military discipline, every number legible, every timestamp exact, every notation cross-referenced to suppliers and ordering dates. Her left hand bore faded scars that mapped themselves across her knuckles and wrist, scars she covered with long sleeves even in Savannah's August heat that pressed against the glass doors like something alive and suffocating. 3 of her colleagues noticed her reviewing old supply orders at 2 a.m., asking innocent questions about vendor contracts, wondering aloud why certain equipment costs had tripled in the last 18 months. They didn't ask follow-up questions. People sensed something about Laura Bennett that discouraged prying. Dr. Marcus Sterling watched her from his office on the 3rd floor, the ER director with silver hair styled like a magazine spread and a Rolex that didn't match his stated salary of $287,000 a year. He'd built a system worth approximately $847,000 in phantom billing codes and inflated supply orders over the past 6 years. Laura's meticulous charting wasn't just thorough. It was a countdown timer, and Sterling could hear it ticking. People with military discipline didn't miss financial irregularities. They noticed patterns. They documented what they saw. They reported up chains of command that didn't stop at hospital administrators. On a Tuesday morning at 8:48 a.m., a wheelchair rolled into Bay 4. The patient wore a faded jacket despite the Georgia heat, his face weathered the way faces become after 2 decades of sun that doesn't forgive and mountains that don't shelter. A woman pushed the wheelchair, his wife, her hand resting on his shoulder with the touch of someone used to holding someone together. The man's name was Marcus Webb, 42 years old, admitted with chest pain and dizziness after receiving 3 phone calls from men who said his dead brother owed them money. Serious money. The kind that carried consequences that moved fast. Laura was assigned to his intake. She moved through the motions with practiced efficiency, a blood pressure, temperature, oxygen saturation. Her voice remained soft, professional, the kind of nurse voice that made patients feel like they weren't bothering anyone. She reached for his jacket to access his upper arm for a proper cuff reading, and that's when her hands froze. The patch was sewn inside the lining of his jacket, barely visible, the kind of detail most people would miss. Faded olive drab fabric bearing the crossed arrow emblem of 7th Special Forces Group. Below it, stitched in black thread now graying with age, Helmand Province, 2003. Her hands didn't tremble, never in public, but something behind her ribs clenched like a fist closing around a memory she'd spent 20 years trying to forget. 20 years ago, she'd been carrying a 7-year-old boy through smoke so thick it tasted like copper and burning diesel. His father was already gone. His mother was already gone. He weighed maybe 40 pounds, but she'd moved through that valley like she was carrying nothing, her hand steady even as mortars fell close enough that shrapnel scored the air like second thoughts. The boy had been wearing a small jacket his father had given him, a gift from an American soldier on patrol, the insignia of some unit that meant nothing to a child but meant everything to his father. She'd carried him 3 miles to an extraction zone where a Black Hawk waited, rotor wash driving rain sideways, and she'd handed him to a medic she'd never seen before or since. The boy in the wheelchair was a man now. Green beret, clearly. Still breathing. Still alive. Laura's voice didn't change. "Let's get your jacket off so I can get an accurate reading." She kept her hand steady as she helped him remove it, their fingers never touching, her breathing controlled and measured like a prayer she'd learned in places that didn't have chaplains. The patch remained hidden as she worked, and he didn't mention it. He stared at her hands while she pressed the blood pressure cuff around his arm, and something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. "You ever serve?" he asked. His voice carried the texture of someone used to asking direct questions and expecting honest answers. "No," Laura said. The lie came out smooth as water. She didn't look at him. She watched the cuff inflate, 128/84. Good. Elevated from the stress, but his baseline was probably higher anyway. Green Berets had baseline readings most civilians wouldn't recover from in a decade. The doctor will be right with you. She charted his vitals with the same obsessive precision she brought to everything, every number exact, every notation complete, and by 10:23 a.m. she was back in Bay 7 helping a 68-year-old man with acute abdomen pain when the monitor in Bay 3 alarmed. 3 sharp beeps. Then flat line. The attending physician, Dr. Raymond Cho, called out orders with the cadence of someone who'd done this 100 times in a city hospital and forgotten that 100 times wasn't enough. They wheeled in the crash cart. They opened the defibrillator pads. They were fumbling with the monitor cables when Laura appeared at their shoulder without anyone calling for her. She'd simply moved. The way trained people move when something in their body recognizes urgency. Tension pneumothorax, she said. Not a question. She could see the collapsed lung, the distended neck veins, the asymmetrical breath sounds that the attending was still searching for. I need a 14-gauge angiocath. 14. Not 16. Dr. Cho stared at her like she'd just spoken Pashto. Miss Bennett, I have this. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Laura was already reaching for the needle, her hands moving with the muscle memory of field triage, of making life and death decisions in 3 seconds because you didn't have 4. You want that vein open before the pressure collapse does permanent damage to his heart. The needle went in. There was a sound, the small sharp hiss of air escaping under pressure, and the patient's oxygen saturation jumped from 76 to 88. His color went from gray to something that resembled living. The attending finally understood what had just happened and started giving orders that Laura had already anticipated. Chest tube. Suction. Oxygen. Dopamine drip at 5 micrograms per kilogram per minute. By 10:34 a.m., the patient was stable and breathing, and Laura had disappeared back into the hallway before anyone could ask her where she'd learned that procedure or what it meant that she'd recognized a tension pneumothorax in 4 seconds flat. She was back in the nurse's station charting when Dr. Marcus Sterling appeared at her shoulder. His cologne smelled like money that pretended it wasn't money, expensive but trying not to show it. His smile never reached his eyes. He'd been watching her work. He'd seen her save a life. He'd also seen her step outside the chain of command, and people like Sterling understood that people like Laura Bennett represented something dangerous, competence that couldn't be controlled, a baseline of excellence that made his fraudulent billing schemes look not just wrong but lazy. Miss Bennett, he said, his voice honeycoated and precise, my office. Now. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a request. It was the kind of tone that worked on nurses who believed doctors were a different species. Laura set down her pen with deliberate care. She glanced at the clock, 10:41 a.m. She'd been at Mercy General for 18 months, and this was the first time the ER director had ever spoken directly to her. She stood. She followed him up the back stairs that smelled like cleaning solution and old decisions. She had no idea what was waiting in that office, but the faded unit patch in Bay 4 was still burning in her peripheral vision, and somewhere in the building, a Green Beret who'd survived Helm and Province was breathing easier because she'd recognized what was killing him in less time than it took to draw a breath. That was the last moment of her old life at Mercy General. Everything that happened next didn't just change the hospital. It brought the Pentagon into play. Sterling's office was a study in controlled intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the parking lot. Mahogany desk that cost more than 3 nurses made in a year. A folder lay centered on the blotter like an accusation. Your charting is excessive, Sterling said, not looking up. His voice carried the practiced condescension of a man who'd never been questioned. Neurotic, even. Are you compensating for something? Laura stood in the doorway. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She said nothing. He continued, finally meeting her eyes. I'm making this simple. You quit by Friday, or I document every tiny deviation until you're unhireable. Think of it as mentorship. Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from deep training. From places where panic cost lives. I've worked in places where mistakes cost lives, Dr. Sterling. I don't cut corners. How noble. He smiled the way a predator smiles before the strike. Dismissed, Florence Nightingale. She turned and left. Behind her, she heard him already making a note on his desk. The pen scratched against paper like a countdown timer. The next morning, the nurse's station hummed with the controlled chaos of shift change. 7 in the morning. Coffee still warming hands. Laura entered vitals into the computer, her fingers moving with mechanical precision. 12 staff members clustered near the assignment board. Sterling stood among them like a general addressing troops. "Gentlemen's bet," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Loud enough that it wasn't a private comment. It was a public execution. Our meticulous Miss Bennett quits within 1 week. I'm giving 3-to-1 odds. She's got that look, doesn't she? The ones who think they're too good for the work never last. Laughter. Nervous and sharp. Some of it genuine. A few younger residents exchanged glances, the kind that said they were calculating whether to laugh harder to stay on Sterling's good side. Laura's jaw tightened. Her fingers paused on the keyboard for exactly 1 second. Then resumed. She felt a single tear escape, just one, and wiped it away without turning around, without breaking eye contact with the monitor. The room smelled like antiseptic and ambition, the particular stench of a hospital where status mattered more than competence. She kept her shoulders straight. Military posture. The kind that said, you see nothing. You affect nothing. She continued working. At lunch, the cafeteria was a collision of voices and overhead fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. The smell of institutional food fought with the sharp note of bleach. Laura carried her tray past Sterling's table, soup, sandwich, water. He was holding court with 3 administrators, his laughter loud and constructed. As she passed, Sterling extended his left foot. Her tray crashed to the floor. The impact came hard enough that the plate shattered. Soup exploded across the tile in a starburst pattern. Silverware scattered like shrapnel. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same time. Sterling turned to his colleagues. Clumsy. Maybe the pressure's getting to Florence. The sound of laughter felt like stones thrown at glass. Laura kneeled. Methodical. She picked up each piece. The broken plate. The silverware. The napkin soaked through with soup. Around her, 100 eyes watched. She could feel the weight of every stare. Her shoulder muscles screamed at her to move faster, to disappear, to show some sign that this was working. She showed nothing. She stood. Made eye contact with Sterling across the cafeteria. I've stitched men back together under mortar fire, your tantrums don't even register as weather. Her voice didn't shake. It sounded like still water. Like something that had been through fire and come out shaped differently. The kind of voice that made people realize they were in a room with someone they didn't understand. Sterling's face went red. Laura walked to the dish returned with perfect posture, her spine like an antenna broadcasting calm. Behind her, she could hear Sterling trying to recover, his voice forced back into its performative register. She didn't look back. That was part of the power, the refusal to check whether her words had landed. She knew they had. She'd been trained to read a room the way other people read books. That afternoon, she reviewed Marcus Webb's admission file at the nurse's station. His chart was methodical. Chest pain. Dizziness. A wife who'd mentioned threatening phone calls. A dead brother named Marcus who'd apparently owed money to people who collected in blood. Sterling appeared beside her without warning. His presence was like a pressure change in the room. He grabbed the patient charts from her hands, not snatched, grabbed, with a violence that made his intentions unmistakable, and hurled them down the hallway. Papers exploded across the linoleum. Charts scattered like a broken deck of cards. 20 feet of chaos. Pick that up, sweetheart. Unless you're too proud for basic nursing tasks. Laura's hands curled into fists. Her nails bit into her palms. The rage that rose in her chest was a familiar thing, hot and sharp and absolutely controlled. She'd felt it before. In Helmand Province. In field hospitals where the casualties outnumbered the resources. In places where rage was a luxury that killed people. She slowly released her fists. "I'm going on break," she said quietly. "I need some jello." Sterling blinked. He'd expected anger. Maybe tears. He'd gotten a non sequitur that made him look stupid. A junior nurse nearby nearly smiled before catching herself. Laura walked toward the pediatric wing where she'd been reassigned 2 hours earlier. Sterling had cited behavioral concerns and interpersonal conflict. What he meant was, "I'm isolating you. I'm pushing you toward the edges. I'm building my case." Behind her, Sterling stood surrounded by scattered papers, his face still red, his authority suddenly feeling very thin. The pediatric wing was quieter than the main ER. Smaller voices. Cartoon characters on the walls. Laura restocked supplies, gauze, saline bags, pediatric bandages with space rockets on them. The smell of industrial cleaner was stronger here, competing with something sweeter. A child crying in one of the bays. A mother's voice trying to soothe. The mundane horror of illness that didn't care about age. Around 7 in the evening, shouting erupted from the main ER. Not the controlled shouting of a code. Something raw. Aggressive. Laura's head came up like a hunting dog catching a scent. She moved toward the commotion on instinct, her body already knowing what her mind was still processing. In Bay 7, Webb lay sedated. Post-admission observation. His wife had gone to the cafeteria 30 minutes earlier. His monitor showed a slow, steady rhythm. He looked peaceful in that way that only drugs could provide. 3 men surrounded his bed. They wore street clothes. Track marks on visible arms. The kind of presentation that announced their business wasn't medical. The largest one, tattoos across his knuckles that spelled words she didn't need to read, pulled a hunting knife from inside his jacket. The blade caught the fluorescent light. "Your brother's debt dies with you," he said to Webb's unconscious face. Laura appeared in the doorway. Every neuron in her nervous system fired. Her pupils dilated. Her heart rate dropped. The same reflex that had saved her life 20 times in 20 years. The lead attacker turned. He saw a woman in scrubs. He saw prey that stood between him and his target. He saw someone small. He did not see what was looking back at him. "Walk away, nurse," he said. Laura stepped between the knife and Webb's chest. Her voice was parade ground calm, the kind of calm that came from standing in rooms where people were dying and your panic wouldn't help them. "You'll have to go through me." The attacker laughed. The sound was brief. He drove the blade forward. Laura didn't flinch. The knife punched through her left shoulder, she felt it like a punch, hot and bright. She gasped but didn't scream. Her right hand already reached for the crash cart. Her left arm hung uselessly, blood spreading across her white scrubs like a red flower blooming. The attackers froze for exactly 2 seconds. Then they ran. Laura's vision blurred but her training held. She saw Webb's chest rising asymmetrically. Heard the wheeze of a collapsing lung. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of injury that killed soldiers and patients with equal indifference. She'd trained for this in field hospitals. Her hands knew what to do. With her right hand, she grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. Her movements were precise despite the pain. Despite the blood. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She positioned the needle and drove it through his chest wall. The hiss of air escaping. Immediate. Unmistakable. His breathing eased. His color improved. She whispered, "Stay with me, Marcus," before collapsing unconscious in a pool of her own blood. Security found them 30 seconds later. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. The doors burst open at 11:13 p.m. 3 men in dark hoodies, faces hard as concrete, moved through the ER like they owned it. The tallest one had prison tattoos crawling up his neck, a spider web, a teardrop, scars that looked older than his body. The smallest one kept his hand in his jacket pocket. The third, the one with shoulders that didn't fit through doorways, scanned the trauma bay with the precision of someone trained to hurt people. Laura was charting at the main desk when the energy in the room shifted. Not a siren shift. Not a code blue shift. A different frequency entirely. The kind of silence that comes before violence. The kind her hands recognized before her mind caught up. The tall one moved toward Trauma Bay 3. Webb was in there. Sedated. Recovering from the emergency decompression Laura had performed 6 hours earlier. His lung had re-expanded. His oxygen sat was 94%. He was breathing on his own. And now 3 gang members were walking toward him with the casual certainty of men collecting a debt. Laura stood without deciding to stand. The charge nurse, Patricia, grabbed her wrist. "Don't. Security's already calling." "How long?" 8 minutes. 8 minutes. The math was simple. Webb couldn't run. Couldn't fight. Couldn't defend himself. And whatever debt his dead brother owed, the men walking toward his bed weren't coming to negotiate. Laura's legs moved anyway, muscle memory converting thought into action before thought finished thinking. She intercepted them at the threshold. "He's not conscious. He's not stable. You need to leave." Her voice was still. Level. The voice of someone stating meteorological fact rather than issuing orders. The tall one didn't slow down. "Move, nurse." It wasn't a request. It was a threat dressed as a command. Behind her, Webb's heart monitor showed a steady rhythm. 78 beats per minute. The baseline of a man asleep. A man who had survived 24 hours in Helmand Province at 7 years old, had survived 3 tours as an adult, and was about to die in Savannah because a dead man's debt had an expiration date that outlived him. Laura didn't move. The tall man shoulder-checked her toward the wall. She absorbed the impact through her left shoulder, rolling with it instead of against it, staying between his body and Webb's bed. The spider web tattoo on his neck was a jailhouse job, India ink and prison needles. The teardrop meant he'd killed someone. The scars meant he'd survived it. "Last warning," he said. His hand came up. Not a fist. Something worse. A buck-folding knife with a blade that caught the fluorescent light like it was hungry for it. The edge wasn't a clean line, it had been sharpened by hands that understood angles and arterial spray. Laura's eyes tracked the trajectory. The blade was aimed at Webb's chest. The angle was perfect. 6 inches of steel moving at the speed of commitment. The sedation in Webb's system meant he wouldn't wake. The monitors wouldn't alarm until damage was already registered in his organs. The blade would penetrate the intercostal space between ribs 5 and 6, probably catch the anterior pericardium, and Webb would bleed out in 4 minutes while Laura watched from 3 feet away. She stepped into the blade's path. The knife entered her left shoulder from the anterior side, sliced through the deltoid muscle, and exited through her trapezius. Pain was information. Burning information. The kind that screamed and then clarified. The kind that showed you exactly what was happening in real time. Tendons. Nerve bundles. Vascular spray that she could feel but not see. Blood started moving, which meant vessels had been opened, which meant time was now a finite quantity. Laura fell backward, collapsing toward Webb's bed, her left arm hanging loose and heavy. But her right hand was already moving. The muscle memory didn't ask permission. It didn't consult ethics committees or hospital protocols or the fact that she was currently bleeding from a puncture wound that was probably damaging the rotator cuff. It just knew. Knew where the landmarks were. Knew the distance. Knew that Webb's chest had started to fail the moment the knife disrupted his newly expanded lung. Her right hand moved on its own. She reached across Webb's chest with fingers that were steady despite the shock trying to pull her under. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers found the rib margins the way they'd found them 800 times before, not in hospitals, but in field stations with no electricity. In tents during sandstorms. In darkness with mortars walking across the FOB in systematic lines. A 14-gauge needle was already in her right hand. She'd never let go of it from the earlier procedure. She didn't remember consciously grabbing it. Her hands had decided independently that there was a needle involved. There was always a needle involved. She drove it through the fascia, through the intercostal muscle, felt the sudden drop of pressure release like air escaping a tire at highway speed. The hiss. Not actual sound. Webb was still sedated, still silent. But the sensation of pressure equalizing, of a pneumothorax decompressing, of a collapsed lung getting room to re-expand. Webb's oxygen saturation was dropping. 92%. 87%. The monitor showed the descent like a plane losing altitude. Laura's right hand was still moving, still performing the procedure, still saving his life while her left shoulder was actively bleeding into her ribs. "Get her down!" Someone was shouting. "Patricia!" The tall man was still holding the bloody knife. The other two were moving toward Laura now, understanding too late that she was the problem, not Webb. But hospital security was coming. She could hear the boots on tile. She could hear someone calling a code. She could hear Webb's heart rate holding steady at 76 beats per minute because the pressure was releasing and the lung was re-expanding, and whatever else happened, that was happening because her right hand hadn't stopped moving. The O2 saturation climbed. 89%. 91%. 93%. Holding. Laura's vision started darking at the edges. Blood loss did that. Gravity did that. The fact that she'd just taken a knife through soft tissue while performing emergency medicine on herself did that. She could taste copper. Could feel her heartbeat getting louder, compensating, trying to maintain pressure with fluid that was actively leaving her body. She didn't flinch. Security tackled the three men in a controlled chaos of uniforms and restraint. The tall one went down hard, the knife skittering across the tile floor. Blood, Webb's blood, Laura's blood, made the floor slick. Someone was shouting for the trauma surgeon. Someone else was already running two 18-gauge lines into Laura's right arm. Patricia was pressing a trauma pad against Laura's shoulder, but the bleeding had already slowed. Not because it had stopped. Because Laura's blood pressure was dropping too fast to maintain flow. Because the body was going into shock and shutting down the non-essential systems. Webb's monitor showed 95% oxygen saturation. His heart rate was 72. He was breathing. Laura felt the stretcher beneath her. Felt her body being moved. Felt the cold rush of shock making her fingers numb and distant. She tried to say something, needed to say something, but her voice wasn't cooperating. The world had a delay on it, like she was speaking into a radio with a 3-second lag. "You need surgery," someone was saying. A doctor. Not Sterling. Someone competent. Laura's jaw moved. Her right hand came up, grabbed the doctor's sleeve. Her voice was barely air. "His chart. Mark him post-decompression, watch for recollapse. Recheck films in 6 hours." The doctor nodded. Understood immediately. Understood that she'd just spent the last of her coherence making sure Webb stayed alive after she was gone. Then there was movement. Fluorescent light sliding past. The smell of antiseptic and her own blood mixing into something that smelled like burnt iron. The sound of her own breathing getting heavier, slower, like she was falling asleep while moving at 30 miles per hour. The ER doors swung open behind her. She didn't know it would be the last time she'd pass through them as an employee. Security brought her back to the ER 2 hours later, after surgery. After they'd stopped the bleeding. After they'd repaired what they could and wrapped what they couldn't. She was in a recovery bed in her own ER, her left shoulder wrapped in white gauze that was already showing a faint rose tint from slow seepage. And 4 was running antibiotics and pain medication that wasn't quite managing to keep the edges of the world from being sharp. 2 Savannah police officers took her statement at 2:15 a.m. The attackers had been arrested 6 blocks away, still running, one of them still holding the knife. Gang-related debt collection. Webb's brother had borrowed money from a cartel organization in Jacksonville. Had died in a drive-by. Had left his debt to his younger brother like an inheritance nobody wanted. The officers were professional. Respectful. They called her and didn't ask her why she'd stepped into a knife for a patient she didn't know. She didn't explain about the unit patch inside Webb's jacket lining. About the symbol that meant Helmand Province. About the fact that she'd saved a 7-year-old boy in a village called Marja 20 years ago and had watched his face as he clung to her in a sandstorm while she carried him 3 miles to an evac zone. She didn't have time to explain. Dr. Sterling arrived at 3:16 a.m. with hospital security and a woman carrying a briefcase. The woman was Janet Reeves, risk management investigator. She had the posture of someone who'd terminated nurses before. The briefcase looked like it contained paperwork designed to make problems disappear. Sterling's face held an expression of deep concern, the face of a man personally pained by what professionalism required him to do. "Laura," he said, his voice gentle as a blade wrapped in velvet. "I'm so glad you're stable. We all are. Everyone here is grateful you're alive." Laura didn't respond. Her left shoulder was a tight knot of pain beneath the gauze. Her blood pressure was still running low. The pain medication made her thoughts move like they were walking through water. "But we need to talk about what happened," Sterling continued. "Your actions, while they may have felt necessary, created an enormous liability exposure for Mercy General. You physically interposed yourself in an active felony. You performed an invasive medical procedure while injured and outside your scope of practice as a floor nurse. You essentially functioned as a tactical operator rather than following hospital protocol." Janet Reeves opened her briefcase. The document inside was already printed. Already official. Already written in the past tense, describing decisions that had apparently already been made. "Miss Bennett," Reeves said, her voice professional and empty, "I'm conducting a formal investigation into unauthorized tactical intervention endangering hospital staff and patients. Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave pending termination. You'll need to surrender your badge." Laura's badge was already gone. She'd noticed that when she woke from surgery. The weight that had been at her hip for 6 years was missing. "I stopped a murder," Laura said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Thin. Like it was coming from very far away. Sterling shook his head with the sadness of a man explaining something to a child who couldn't understand. "You acted as a vigilante, not as a nurse. Your heroism doesn't change the fact that you violated protocol. You endangered your own life and the lives of everyone on this floor." The plastic bag containing her personal effects was waiting on the chair beside her bed. Her scrubs from that morning. Her wallet. Her personal keys. Her stethoscope. Her trauma shears. Everything that made her a nurse, now reduced to items to be returned. Hospital security escorted her out at 4:23 a.m. She was still bandaged. Still limping. Still wearing the hospital gown beneath the borrowed coat they'd given her. The lobby was empty except for the security guard at the desk, who didn't meet her eyes as she passed. The automatic doors opened onto a Savannah morning that was just starting to remember it was April. Rain was coming. She could smell it in the air, ozone and wet pavement and possibility of lightning. Her car was parked in the employee lot, 3 sections over. She made it to the driver's seat before the first real wave of shock hit her. Not physical shock. Hospital shock. She'd walked away from the Navy to escape this. had spent 6 years hiding behind scrubs and anonymity at Mercy General, thinking that if nobody knew who she'd been, nobody would expect anything from her ever again. She'd been wrong. She woke to the sound of her own heart monitor, a steady electronic pulse that felt like someone else's rhythm. The ER ceiling stared back at her, fluorescent tiles arranged in perfect grids, the same tiles she'd walked under for 6 years without ever really seeing them. Now she saw nothing else. An 4-line threaded through her left arm, taped down with careful precision. Someone else's work. The bandage on her shoulder was professional, layered gauze that whispered against the hospital gown when she breathed. Her right arm lay useless at her side, padded and immobilized. She'd been conscious for maybe an hour before Sterling appeared in her doorway, his expression arranged like concern but his eyes calculating distance and advantage like a predator assessing prey. He didn't enter the room immediately. He stood in the threshold, letting her see him there, letting her understand the power dynamic had shifted. Laura. Just her name. No title, no respect. That was quite a performance out there. She didn't respond. The monitors recorded her stillness. You understand what happened, don't you? He moved into the room now, his shoes clicking against linoleum with metronomic precision. You stepped into an active security situation. Took a blade that wasn't intended for you. That's not bravery, that's recklessness. That's a liability. The patient's lung was collapsing. Her voice came out level, measured, like she was reading vitals off a chart. It was the voice she'd learned to use in places where emotion got people killed. Sterling didn't like it. She could see him working through his response, adjusting his approach like a chess player who'd encountered an unexpected defense. Yes. And you performed emergency intervention without authorization from the attending physician. Without calling for backup. Without following any protocol whatsoever. He moved closer to the bed, his tie catching the harsh light. He was already thinking 2 moves ahead. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. I'm going to have to report this to the board, of course. Gross violation of patient care protocols. Workplace safety standards. The hospital has insurance, but my responsibility is to the institution first. She understood what he was doing. He wasn't angry about the knife or the blood or the drama. He was using the stabbing as his exit strategy, a clean extraction from the threat she represented. A single incident he could weaponize, transform from her act of heroism into her act of recklessness. 1 knife wound and suddenly 6 years of flawless charting, of court mistakes, of suspicious billing patterns, all of it disappeared under the weight of this one moment. I saved his life, she said quietly. You violated every safety protocol in our institution. Sterling pulled his phone from his pocket, and she heard him making calls before he even left her room. First to the chief of surgery, we need to discuss an incident report. Then to a board member she'd never met, one of our nurses took a stab wound. Literally. Inserted herself into an active security situation. I'm concerned about her judgment, frankly. Mental health, maybe. We might need to accelerate some conversations. She lay there and listened to her own character being dismantled, piece by piece, by someone she'd never challenged, never threatened directly. But she had. That was the real problem. She'd challenged him by existing, by being competent, by noticing things he didn't want noticed. By the next morning, an HR investigator named Reeves arrived with a folder and sympathetic eyes. He was the kind of man who apologized while he destroyed you. Just routine, he kept saying. Standard protocol after an incident with injury. He'd already spoken to Sterling, already spoken to the 3 gang members who'd fled when security arrived. He had statements. He had a narrative. He was building a case, brick by brick, using her own courage as the mortar. Can you walk me through exactly what you were thinking? Reeves sat in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, pen poised. When you intervened. My patient was in distress. Right. But there was security present. There were protocols. Why not wait for? His lung was collapsing. Tension pneumothorax. Every second mattered. Reeves nodded like he understood, but his pen kept moving. He was transcribing her into a problem. By afternoon, Sterling had contacted her Navy references, people she'd listed a decade ago, people from her old life who barely remembered her. Reeves told her this with genuine regret, like he was delivering bad news. Your former commanding officer was concerned about unresolved military trauma. Combat-related PTSD. He suggested your current position might be triggering behavioral responses that aren't entirely appropriate for a civilian setting. That was the kill shot. They weren't firing her for taking a knife. They were firing her for being broken. For being the kind of woman who existed in a state of constant readiness, who saw threats where normal people saw confusion, who moved when others froze. They were medicating her entire existence into pathology. By day 3, security came to walk her out. She was still bandaged, still moving slow, still tethered to the reality that her body had been violated and her career had been erased in the same motion. They gave her a box of her personal items, a change of clothes, the coffee mug from her locker, her personnel file in a manila envelope marked separation of employment. She didn't look inside it. The rain started just as they reached the parking lot, a steady Savannah downpour that felt like disappointment. It hammered the asphalt in that particular way that sounded almost musical if you listened long enough, almost like applause for something you'd lost. She walked to her truck without an umbrella, letting the water soak through her clothes, watching the bandage on her shoulder darken with moisture and the slow seepage of something that might have been blood or might have been the day falling apart around her. 3 days later, she sat in the waiting room of the Savannah VA hospital on Victory Drive, surrounded by men who carried their wars in their spines and their silences. The plastic chairs were arranged in rows like penitents, and every man in the room had that same look, eyes that had seen things the world had promised would heal them and then lied. A young Marine with a prosthetic leg was filling out intake forms with hands that trembled. An older man rocked slightly, muttering coordinates to himself, lat and long of places that didn't exist anymore or had never existed outside his own memory. She belonged here now. Not as the one who fixed people. As the one who was broken. The folder on her lap contained her termination paperwork, 30 pages of Reeves' assessment painting her as a dangerous liability, as someone with unresolved military trauma manifesting as workplace aggression, as a woman who couldn't be trusted around patients because she might save them in ways that violated protocol. She'd read it twice, each word landing like small calculated wounds. Her phone buzzed. A call from her sister in Atlanta, the 4th one this week. She didn't answer. How would she explain this? How would she tell someone from the civilian world that she'd been fired for being too good at keeping people alive? That the only skill she had that mattered was now classified as a mental illness, that her instinct to move and act and save had been rebranded as a syndrome that needed treatment. She'd walked away from the Navy without forwarding addresses, burned every bridge systematically and carefully so that no one could find her, so that no one would expect anything from her, so that she could just exist as a nurse, quiet and anonymous and safe. But the Navy had found her anyway, just not in time to matter. She'd been fired before anyone in her old life even knew she'd been wounded. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and something else, resignation, maybe. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like electrical insects trapped in plastic casings. Every man here was waiting for someone to help them remember how to be whole, and she was one of them now, a patient instead of a provider, the one in need instead of the one needed. Her appointment was listed for 2 in the afternoon. She had 6 minutes. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for her name to be called, surrounded by the sounds of men who'd given everything and received nothing but silence in return. Webb's eyes opened at 3:38 a.m. The monitor beside his bed traced a steady rhythm, beep, 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 like a metronome keeping time with his returning heartbeat. For a moment he stared at the ceiling tiles, dust motes floating in the cold blue glow of the ICU, and then the memory surfaced with the force of a breaching whale, small hands holding his, steady hands, scarred hands pressing a bandage to his shoulder while a woman's voice cut through the chaos like a knife through silk. "Stay with me, buddy. You're going to be okay. You're going to be a warrior someday." He turned his head toward the nurse's station. The young RN who'd been checking his vitals every hour, Sandra, or maybe Sarah, was restocking supplies 2 rooms down. But it wasn't her face he needed to see. His hand went to his chest, to the scar tissue already beginning to form beneath the surgical dressing, and he pressed gently. The memory wasn't a dream. Those hands. He would know them anywhere. The next time the ER nurse entered his room, the one with the bandaged shoulder and the eyes that held the weight of 20 years, he was ready. His voice came out hoarse from the breathing tube they'd finally extubated 6 hours ago, but steady. "Senior Chief." She froze. The clipboard she'd been holding dipped slightly. "The one who saved my life. In Helmand. When I was a kid. You carried me 3 miles to the evac zone." Laura Bennett didn't move. Didn't speak. The silence stretched like taffy being pulled, thinning, threatening to snap. "I remember your hands," Webb said. "I've spent 20 years trying to find you. Your hands are scarred. Right across the knuckles. You got them from." "Don't." Laura's voice came out like a command. Like she was ordering an entire operating room to stand down. One word. That's all she gave him before turning toward the door. It wasn't a request. It was a command. But the Marine gunnery sergeant who'd arrived that morning, the one with the dress blues and the jaw like granite and the eyes that didn't miss anything, had heard the exchange from the hallway. He'd been reviewing Webb's chart when the patient spoke, and something about those words made him turn to Laura, really look at her, and then down at his file again. He read aloud, his voice beginning to tremble at the first name, Laura Bennett. "Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, Medical Corps. Helmand Province, 2004. Tour duration, 14 months. Decorations," his voice cracked. "Bronze Star with Valor. Bronze Star with Valor again. Navy Cross. Navy Cross. Navy Cross. 3 Navy Crosses for distinguished service in combat. Architect of the Helmand Province Combat Triage Protocol, credited with establishing emergency medical procedures that resulted in, he had to stop and breathe." The file trembled in his hands. Protocol implementation resulted in 847 lives saved over 18-month operational window. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Laura stood at the door without turning around. Her left shoulder, the one with the fresh wound, was rigid beneath the sling. A muscle worked in her jaw. The door burst open and a SEAL team leader walked in. Not walked. Moved like he owned the air around him, like the room's dimensions had been rearranged to accommodate his presence. His face was weathered to the color of old oak, and his eyes found Laura and stayed there. Behind him came Dr. Sterling, and for the first time, the surgeon looked small. Diminished. Like someone had reduced him by 20% across all dimensions. The SEAL commander stepped between Laura and the exit and spoke with the precision of someone giving coordinates to a fire team. Bronze Star with Valor, 2006. Second Bronze Star with Valor, 2008. Navy Cross, 2009. Navy Cross, 2010. Navy Cross, 2012. That's the official record. The classified record lists another 7 commendations we can't discuss in this room. He paused. "Let that breathe. You served with her. You know what that means." Sterling's face had gone the color of old concrete. The SEAL continued without breaking eye contact with Laura. "You trained medics who trained medics. The protocol you designed is being taught at Walter Reed, Johns Hopkins, every major trauma center on the East Coast. You saved people you never met because you cared enough to codify what you'd learned." He stepped closer. "And someone threw your charts on the floor and called you sweetheart while you bled." The FBI agent arrived at 9:23 a.m., federal credentials clipped to her belt, a folder the color of old parchment tucked beneath her arm. The hospital board had convened an emergency session, emergency being code for terrified, for covering their exposure, for realizing they'd hired a man who'd stolen $2.3 million in inflated supply orders and phantom billing codes over 4 years. The agent stood in the CEO's office with 2 Marine officers flanking the door like sentries and laid out the evidence: falsified vendor invoices, kickback agreements, shell companies registered in Sterling's mother-in-law's name in Delaware, a pattern of fraud so comprehensive and systemic that the board members started looking around the room as if the walls themselves had become evidence. Board Chairman Walsh took approximately 45 seconds to remember his survival instinct. He acted alone. "I want him gone." By 10:15 a.m., Sterling was being escorted through the main lobby of Mercy General by hospital security and 2 Marine military police. The local news cameras, tipped off by a military public affairs officer who'd been waiting all morning for exactly this moment, captured every frame: the CEO standing at a podium with her words written on a prepared statement, 2 Marine officers in dress blues flanking her shoulders like parentheses, her voice steady as a surgical laser as she read the termination. Dr. Marcus Sterling is terminated effective immediately for fraud, witness intimidation, and retaliation against a decorated military veteran. His medical license is under review by the State Medical Board, and federal charges are pending. Sterling saw Laura in the crowd of assembled staff, nurses, doctors, administrators, orderlies, and something in him fractured. He tried to speak, tried to make his mouth form words that might undo what was about to happen. "You don't understand. I was protecting the hospital. I was trying to." A Marine colonel stepped forward. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all controlled power and absolute zero negotiation. "You bullied a woman with 3 Navy crosses because she saw your crimes. You threw her charts on the floor. You called her sweetheart while she bled, saving a life. You had her escorted from this building to cover your tracks." The colonel paused, letting his gaze settle on Sterling like a sniper's crosshairs. "In my experience, when you humiliate someone with nothing left to lose, you're not protecting anything. You're just speeding up the inevitable." The cameras captured Sterling's wife divorcing him in court papers filed within 30 days. Captured his medical license being revoked by the state board. Captured him accepting a plea deal that resulted in probation and restitution and cooperation against the vendors and consultants who'd helped him fabricate the billing. Captured the entire architecture of his life being dismantled on local news at 6 and 11. 6 months later, Laura drove past a strip mall off Highway 80, past the businesses trying to maintain dignity in a row of fluorescent-lit storefronts, and there he was, Dr. Marcus Sterling at a folding table with a banner that read supplemental insurance plans in letters that looked like they'd been printed at a Kinko's. He was handing a flyer to a woman pushing a shopping cart. He looked thinner. Diminished. Like someone had reduced him by 30% across all dimensions and the remainder didn't add up to anything worth counting. Their eyes met through the windshield of her truck. Laura didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge. Just kept driving, the rearview mirror erasing him into a memory of a man who'd never existed at all. That same week, Marcus Webb visited her office at the Savannah VA hospital. He carried a photograph in a frame the color of old mahogany. Laura recognized herself before she recognized him, 7-year-old Marcus on a medical cot, his small hand holding the scarred hand of a young Navy corpsman whose face was turned away. "My wife found this in my mom's things. I've carried the memory of those hands my whole life. Thank you for carrying me then. Thank you for standing in front of me now." Laura's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. That was the difference between breaking and standing. "You became the warrior I hoped you'd be. That's thanks enough." Her first day as chief medical officer began at 6:27 a.m. when she parked in the visitor lot out of habit, muscle memory stronger than rank or position, and walked toward the main entrance in her dress uniform, Navy service blues worn for the first time in 3 years, her chest heavy with medals she'd kept in a showbox at the back of her closet. She saw the crowd before understanding formed, 150 Marines in dress blues forming 2 perfect lines from the parking lot to the entrance, standing at attention in absolute silence. The SEAL commander stood at the door. Webb stepped to her right shoulder as she began to walk. Every Marine saluted as she passed, hands snapping to foreheads in synchronization that looked like choreography, held until she was 3 steps beyond, then lowering in unison. The only sounds were wind and her footsteps on concrete, boots making soft contact with each step. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them. Her back remained straight. Her head remained high. A Marine general pinned her retired rank insignia to her collar, 2 gold dolphins and a crown, and whispered words she felt rather than heard, "Welcome home, Senior Chief." Inside the hospital, the staff lined the corridors, applauding. Doctors in white coats. Nurses in scrubs. Patients in wheelchairs. The young Marine with the prosthetic leg from the waiting room stood with the others, no longer shaking. Laura reached her office, turned to face the assembled crowd, and spoke in a voice that had commanded operating rooms and saved lives and carried the weight of 30 years without asking anyone to notice. "I walked away from this world because I thought I'd given everything. You just taught me I had more to give. For every veteran in this building, you carried the weight. Now let me help carry yours." 6 months later, Savannah VA Hospital had the highest patient satisfaction and lowest wait times in the region. Laura had implemented the Hellman Protocol hospital-wide, training civilian doctors in combat triage adaptations that saved 14 lives in the first year. She never hid her scars again. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated or overlooked, subscribe to see more. Hit that like button and drop a comment. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Because the veterans we honor today are living among us right now, often in places we'd never think to look.